Chantal, thank you so much for joining us today. If you could start with a quick intro, that would be fantastic.
Sure, I'm happy to. Hi, I'm Chantal Forster, and I'm the AI strategy resident for the Annenberg Foundation in LA. It's a residency, it's a 6-month residency. It's a bit like, didn't Lady Gaga have some piano residency in Las Vegas this summer? It's sort of like being the Lady Gaga of AI and philanthropy. So I've been serving them for 4 months as their strategy resident. And prior to that, I was the executive director of the Technology Association of Grantmakers. For the past 6 years, I led that organization, and our membership was comprised of technology staff, leaders, vendors, accidental techies working at foundations throughout the world. And I'm fortunate enough to also be currently advising my successor, the wonderful Jean Westrick, now ED of TAG. I serve her as their advisor on AI strategy as well.
And we're going to dive into all of that in a minute, but I like to start out with a question with all of our guests, which is, tell me about the moment that you first interacted with AI. And you can define AI however you need to.
Yeah. I wonder how far back people are going for you. Do you know what's interesting is the first time I remember hearing about AI was in the early 90s. My dad was working on a master's in AI at DePaul University in Chicago. And his job, he's an engineer, an industrial engineer. He was working at the steel mills on the south side of the Great Lakes, automating their steel making systems. And he was using AI to develop automated guided vehicles. So I wasn't using it. My dad was, and I remember that distinctly. But, the first time I used it was my first job out of undergrad in the late 90s. I was working for SPSS, Predictive Analytics. We didn't call it AI then, but it was AI. I was working as a tech writer on their data mining platform. It was called Clementine. It's now part of Watson Studio. And I was the tech writer on it's called CRISP-DM, Cross Industry Standard Process for Data Mining. And that was my first foray into AI, all sorts of market basket analysis, network analysis, fraud detection. We didn't call it AI then, but that's what it was.
When you were interacting with this technology, did you have a glimpse into what it was going to be turning into?
I can't say that I predicted the Gen AI piece, but that could be in part because I personally am not a computer scientist. I was on the human end of things. So I certainly saw at that time the ability to get closer to what humans need through predictive analytics, get closer to understanding the human condition and the inner workings of society through predictive analytics. And I thought that that was a great benefit. I saw the way that the IRS, for example, was detecting fraudulent returns in a much faster cost savings method than they were prior. Well, that saves taxpayer dollars, right? And so I could see the benefit at that time, but I don't think I could have predicted Gen AI.
So when Gen AI started to emerge, what was your first interaction with it or experience with it?
Well, the hype, right? It came out, everyone was talking about it. My first reaction was a little bit uncanny valley. You heard the term of when robots or automated generated imagery, human-like imagery starts to become too human-like. People have an adverse reaction to it. My first reaction to Gen AI and the kind of walk-up friendly chatbots was that people are going to freak out. They're going to freak out because it feels human. It's not. It's pattern matching behind the scenes. It's not actually creating brand new. It's pattern matching and generating something that feels brand new and feels human-like. And so my first reaction was, this is A, cool, but B, going to freak some people out.
Okay, but did you freak out a little bit? Just
a
little?
You know what? I did not.
Okay. What do you think that's because of your background or?
It probably is because I've been part of the story. And while AI now feels like it came out of nowhere for many people, if you've been part of the story and somewhat of a boring backstory, right? Nobody was talking about it. My mom still has no idea what I've been doing in my career. If you've been a part of that story, I guess it feels sort of like the natural evolution. And you can also see the flaws in the current approaches as well, right? You can see where Gen AI still has a lot of room to grow and evolve.
Let's talk a little bit more. I know you said it was a boring backstory, but this is about the humans of AI, right? Talk to us about how you became part of that story and how you moved specifically into the space of technology and philanthropy.
Well, rarely do people want to talk about the boring backstory, so I'm glad to be here. For me, I've worked in all three sectors. So I mentioned I worked for SPSS Predictive Analytics in the private sector. I later ran digital for the mayor of Albuquerque, New Mexico, working in the public sector, and then eventually worked as a tech advisor for nonprofits and philanthropy, starting in New Mexico. And then when I moved back to Chicago about 8-9 years ago, expanding that to a more national and global presence. And I think that each of those sectors have a different pace. And I think because I started in the private sector, my natural cycle is a bit faster than some of the other sectors. So it can be a challenge to me sometimes working in the social sector on tech, but it's incredibly rewarding to know that your time, or at least my time, my short time on the planet, is tracking towards solutions that I hope promote thriving for humans and our fellow species. That's a long way of saying it's feel good. And one often comes to a place in their career, especially if you've been working in tech, you start to wonder why. And when that why can connect with something that has meaning for, the natural world, including our species, I think you're naturally drawn to that. At least I was.
When people say philanthropy to the average human being,
Mhm.
uh, they think about that feel good outcome, right? They think about also, I hear Annenberg Foundation and I immediately think this program was underwritten by the Annenberg Foundation, right? That's
Right.
immediately, I'm a public radio nerd, okay?
Mhm.
So the outcome of that is very apparent, but the inner mechanisms of getting to that point is not, right? It's interesting because I work in tech and we are all about this is the mechanism. This is about processing things and making
Mhm.
streamlining things. And your sector is very much about human outcome. So, can you talk to me a little bit more about how you came to that discovery of, oh, this is where I fit in into this world?
Laura, I could not love this question more. And I'm struck by listening to you ask it, how the roots of what has drawn me to this side of the how the impact gets made, right, go deep. So I mentioned my father working at the steel mills on the Great Lakes. And so I grew up on the south side of Chicago, in the south suburbs of Chicago. It is the industrial side of the city. It's where the sausage literally got made. It's where you see what I think of as like the guts of greatness, like what it really takes to pull off a great metropolis like Chicago or like any large metropolis in the city. There's always the inner workings of how that collective greatness gets pulled off. And I think because I grew up there, I've always been drawn to the intricacies of how to execute on something bigger than a single individual. And I think that the fact that I'm now on the operations side of philanthropy is probably no accident as a result of that, because the inner workings of how you get to that social impact are very complicated. And we don't often think about that in philanthropy. In fact, that can be one of the challenges of philanthropy, wrestling with AI, frankly, is people who are drawn to work at foundations tend to be very mission driven people. And sometimes that leads to naivete or unawareness, or maybe even a little bit of hostility toward technology that can undermine their ability to realize that impact. I'll be concrete. Like, it's 2024, right? Every touch point a nonprofit has with a grant maker, a foundation, is mitigated by technology, whether that's email, website, online application, reporting. It's all mitigated by technology. So the skeleton at this point of philanthropy is technology, whether we know it or not. So sometimes it's an uphill battle working in philanthropy on a somewhat under-recognized component of mission enablement, but I happen to love it.
Which brings me to this residency. I guess the first question is, why residency, right? What's the nature of that program, and how does it intersect with Annenberg Foundation's mission?
Mhm.
And what drew you to Annenberg Foundation?
So some foundations, some organizations, you've seen the conversation around, do you need a chief AI officer, right? This is a common question we're seeing right now. Some larger foundations have indeed hired a permanent AI advisory position. The average foundation, let's say a grant maker with $500 million in assets up to like $1 billion in assets. And many of the foundations you hear of regularly, Gates, MacArthur, Novo Nordisk, I mean, these are 10 plus billion in assets. So the average foundation between 250 and $1 billion. I don't believe they need a permanent AI related position. However, I'll quote a colleague from a West Coast funder in the Pacific Northwest, smaller foundation. They were being frank about AI in their organization. They said, it's chaos. It's chaos right now in philanthropy. We don't know where to start. We don't know what guardrails to put in place. We don't know how to bring conversation around AI together to be more strategic. It's very focused on point solutions. So the Annenberg Foundation realized this and has somewhat of a history of bringing in these advisory residents. I think we invented the term for this one, but bringing in these advisory folks on a short-term basis to help them navigate a particularly salient topic, either to their mission or in society. And so this was one of those cases. Now, what drew me to Annenberg, because they weren't the only foundation reaching out to me, which is a lovely honor, they were very interested in taking a 360-degree approach to AI. So not just AI initiatives housed out of the tech team, or not just AI initiatives hosted out of the program team. This was coming from the CEO's office. They wanted to wrestle with AI across the organization. Because siloing has historically been such a problem in philanthropy, the sparks went off for me. A foundation that finally wants to wrestle with emerging technology in an interdepartmental, cross-silo fashion, I'm there. That's exactly what drew me to their work. And, they're a very unique foundation. They're a family foundation. All the trustees are, still from one of America's great families. And I do believe they have a uniquely innovation-oriented culture. There are some quotes from Wallace Annenberg out there about, courage and boldness. And I think that they have a relatively small team, 30 people or so, but they move quickly. And they believe that it is their responsibility to grapple with the issues of our time and to make bold moves. And that size is important. There's a colleague of mine, Henry Toledo, out of the Kalamazoo, CTO of the Kalamazoo Community Foundation in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And he said last week on an event we did together about AI that small is a superpower when it comes to experimenting with emerging technology. Small is a superpower. And what they're doing at Kazoo Community Foundation, as they lovingly call it, is ahead of what many foundations in North America are doing. So kudos to Henry, and I couldn't agree more. And that's why I chose to accept the residency with Annenberg.
So what are the superpowers you're discovering? What are the use cases that are emerging that are like that beautiful intersection between AI and philanthropy?
Yeah. We are experimenting with a number of things. And so what I'll share, I don't want to share exactly what Annenberg is doing, but what I can share is what we're doing that aligns with our peers. So at the moment, most mid-sized foundations are exploring org-wide licenses for AI chatbots, right? They're starting to explore custom chatbots to perhaps support IT help desk, to put all of the organizational policies in place and have an internal facing chatbot to query for new employees, or almost as a replacement intranet. Experimenting with that. Very emergent is looking at all the historic grant making records of an organization, which are typically very siloed. And Gen AI is great at this, looking across information silos and discovering new connections, discovering new insights. That's still very emergent. Very few foundations are doing that, but we're starting to talk about it. Some of the larger foundations are setting up private LLMs on, private instances of Azure, AWS, and really beginning to develop potential apps that are unique to their organization. So still very emergent, I would say, and very few have been comfortable in developing AI solutions that are public facing quite yet. Mm-hmm. I think that's something the sector should rise to the occasion of. There's enough hallucination, not enough source citation that philanthropy is comfortable quite yet exposing any chatbots or custom AI applications externally to their grantees, nonprofits, partners, or the world.
And that actually brings us to the idea of responsibility, mm-hmm. right? And ethical application, and ultimately transparency when it comes to AI. How are you approaching it? And what are some ways that you're providing guidance to the Annenberg Foundation on that?
This is one of the most important topics. Responsible AI is one of the most important topics to philanthropy right now. Some foundations have put a pause on AI experimentation altogether because they don't yet know how to begin wrestling. I personally think that's the wrong approach, or if it's an approach, I urge folks to have to be a temporary approach. We're coalescing about what responsible AI means, right? It means transparency in usage. It means explainability. It means inclusion, all sorts of, the 6 principles that we're starting to see. One of the things we did at the Annenberg Foundation was, this is a change management role. So yes, it's about the tech, but it's about people and culture. And so the people and culture may not yet be ready to just plug and play when it comes to responsible AI. So at one point we conducted an exercise in Mural where we had a whiteboard with the kind of 6 increasingly standard responsible AI principles. And we asked the team, all staff, to interpret those for the context of the foundation. In shorthand, what does transparency mean to you? What does inclusion mean to you at the Annenberg Foundation? And we discovered some really unexpected things. For example, to staff, inclusion meant all staff get access to AI tools, not just the cool kids, not just the prominent department, not just the public-facing departments, but all of us get access to the same AI tools. And all of us get access to the training we need to best use those tools. So it's not just a matter of provisioning them and the tech savvy folks are off and running. All of us want to be able to use these tools. We don't want to be left behind. I didn't predict that. I couldn't have predicted that that's what inclusion meant. And I'm so grateful to the staff who are willing to unearth that. And we've certainly incorporated that in our policy for AI.
That is such a cool exercise. There is kind of this assumption that if you say transparency, everybody knows what transparency means, right? No, it's actually kind of a generic term at this point. And we do need to understand what, the lived experience is that plays into that interpretation of these ideas. So good on you.
Well, we're still learning, so thank you. It's a starting point.
What are some narratives about AI that you might be coming up against that are kind of because of the hype or because of fear? Or, what are the negative narratives that you're working against? Or you're like, hey, we need to understand where these negative narratives are coming from so we can work our way through them.
There's some that I'm encountering writ large. There's an interesting pulse check survey that a firm called Submittable did at the Peak Grantmaking Conference about how people were feeling about AI at that conference. And the predominant thought was nervousness that AI is going to cause us to lose our humanity. And so pulling on that thread and being more concrete about what I'm seeing and hearing, I do think that there is concern that AI is going to diminish the relational part of our work, that it's going to replace jobs, that it's going to cause inequitable, or increase, I should say, increase inequitable outcomes. And so I cannot point by point refute all of those, but I will say that the philanthropic sector is largely somewhat tech naive at best, in some cases. At worst, it's like genuinely tech averse because of what we described earlier. It's very mission oriented. And so if you were a tech savvy person, you might not have been attracted to this particular sector. One of the techniques I've used to try to understand this is with the Annenberg Foundation, for example. We conducted a staff pulse check survey asking staff, this was anonymous, by the way, which is the only way you get great data about AI usage. What are you currently doing? What would you like to be doing with AI? What are your concerns about AI? Maybe a couple more questions. We asked the same exact questions of our grantees. And that allowed us to unearth what I'm calling a bias of privilege. The nonprofit grantees, and I wrote about this on LinkedIn with the permission of the organization, our nonprofit grantees would like to use AI in every type of use case more than foundation staff. So I'll reframe that. Foundation staff did not feel the same sense of urgency or desire to use AI in almost every type of usage as our nonprofit partners. So, it's the nature of philanthropy to not have parameters. We write our own checks, right? We don't earn income. We don't chase dollars. In fact, our entire existence is predicated upon giving away enough dollars to maintain our nonprofit status. Nonprofits have the exact opposite problem. They're chasing dollars every day to fulfill their mission. So I think that we have, Laura, and it's hard for me to say this out loud because I love the sector I'm working in. I think we have the privilege to be inefficient. Nonprofits don't have the privilege to be inefficient. And we in philanthropy do. And I think we need to recognize that, wrestle with that, and ultimately realize that we may need, in order to help our nonprofits achieve their mission, become more tech savvy, more willing to experiment with tech, and more willing to fund tech.
We were talking about how the sausage gets made and the skeleton is the technology, but what are the human outcomes of efficiency? Obviously, these nonprofits are getting their money faster, but, and what does that lead to? Talk to me about the ripple effect.
Yeah, I love this question because there's two parts to it. So how philanthropy gets done and the outcome of philanthropy are two separate questions. How philanthropy gets done. There's a conversation right now in the sector around, should we be more trust-based? Should we be more relational in how we make grants and how we work with nonprofits? That's divorced from the question of the outcomes. Are the outcomes better, right? Do we help more third graders on the south side of Chicago read better if it's a trust-based approach? I don't know. And I don't know that we have the science on that yet. So I'm going to stay right now with the how. One of the things I often say to people is emerging tech like AI should liberate your nonprofits and your program staff from the onerous, repetitive tasks so they have more time to be relational. Because right now what we're doing is we're not eliminating the repetitive, onerous tasks. We're adding on more relational pieces like, oh, well, let's talk about that. Let's get to know let's have a phone interview for your proposition or your, proposal. There are some nonprofits that report these relational models take them longer than a traditional grant application model. I'd like to see AI streamline the boring, onerous parts of the process so that we have more time to be human together. So we have more time to get to know each other. Now, on the outcome side, that is a separate question. And I'll be honest, I have a master's in public policy, and I have not yet seen the data on the relationship between the how the grant making happens and the greater efficacy in realizing outcomes. It's not to say it isn't working. I haven't seen the data on it yet.
Understood. We have anecdotal stories from previous guests who've seen, well, okay, the grant making process is there, but then We also have examples of people who are able to, do asylum applications faster with AI, and that means people get housed faster or placed out of refugee camps faster, for example. So that's, I hope that line is drawn vividly in the future so we can find that data and prove, no, this is going in the right direction.
Mhm.
Are there any, and it doesn't have to be at Annenberg, but any use cases or superpowers you're seeing happen in right now with generative AI that are getting you excited and making you want to lean forward a little bit more into it?
Thinking about the everyday, thinking about my community here in Chicago, one of the things I'm most excited about with AI is the ability for in education, helping disadvantaged students with virtual mentoring, scaling mentoring programs. I mean, think about any reading mentorship program has relied on individual human beings, of which there's a limited supply. And if you can scale a reading coach for a second grader trying to attain a base level of reading skill, you can reach 150,000 students
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to 5,000 a year because your volunteer base is limited. I'm particularly excited about that. I think living in a democracy, having an educated citizenry is one of the most important things, in my opinion, for the stability of our democracy. And to uplift everyone to a baseline level of literacy and, math sufficiency is so important. So I'm really excited about that particular use case. Kind of zooming out one level then, with grant making, one of the things I'm most excited about, somewhat controversial, is I think AI will change and dispense with grant applications altogether. Because what I'm seeing is nonprofits secretly using AI to apply for grants, foundations somewhat secretly, some not secretly, using AI to assess grant applications. When you see both sides of a process using AI to automate that process, there's something wrong with that process. So I think we'll probably see more of an AI enabled matchmaking between funders and grantees, not a 100% automated process, but like a suggested process, like a dating app. I'm not saying grant making is like dating. However, there are numerous analogies where a market matchmakes people with the use of AI, and there's many points for human intervention and human decision making and relationship building throughout that process. I think we'll see something like that in philanthropy, and I'm excited for it.
We've had this conversation a lot with people being like, you've got two sides of people using AI. When you've got one of our previous guests called the marionette issue, right? Avatars for people chatting at each other that aren't actually the people. Um, any other instances of that?
Have your marionette talk to my marionette to schedule a meeting for us?
Right. And what you're saying is, well, if that's the case, then there's an app for that will just take care of that entire process. So that way the human part of the equation can move forward. Yeah.
I think yes. And in philanthropy, there is some complexity because of the due diligence piece, right? The financial due diligence. So the ecosystem is such that yes, there's an app for that, or there will be, or could be. But at the same time, there's a data layer. So the data upon which grant nonprofits and foundations find each other and vet each other has to be some form of common data, right? There has to be a pool of shared data for that to occur. And that's something we're wrestling with as a sector. Who owns that pooled data? Is it Candid, who is a nonprofit? Is it a private company that's building the app on top of it? My personal opinion is I think you do need separate ownership and governance between the data layer and the app layer on top of it. But there's some jostling and competitiveness in the sector right now about who will own that data layer, even competition between nonprofits for who will own that data layer.
How do you feel about like kind of being at the forefront of that wrestling match? Not wrestling match, but jostling. Is that
Oh,
something that excites you? Or, how do you, because, this is the moment where people can really nerd out, right? Uh,
you're getting to the heart of the matter here, Laura. I think some competition is good in the social sector. I do. I think that nonprofits, having some element, having some heat, having some fire, right? Having foundations have some competitiveness here can be very healthy for innovation. The funny thing about our sector, though, is when I've had panels where I brought all these competitors for the data commons onto the same panel, they don't want to own that they're being competitive. So when I highlight that, they don't want to say it out loud because of the nature of our sector. We want to pretend as though we're all getting along and pretend that there's a solution where we could all co-create or co-own. And so it's a funny business in our sector to be in a competitive space, but I do find it very energizing. I enjoy trying to sort through these issues with clients, with organizations, and even advise multiple parties in that competitive space without violating anyone's privacy about the potential roadmaps for resolving some of this competitiveness toward a beneficial solution.
I have a private sector question about
Mm-hmm.
this. In private sector, obviously, the winner of whatever competition, it's because it's a race to the profit or a race to the wealth accumulation. What's the race toward if there's a sense of, an unmentionable sense of competition in the philanthropy and nonprofit sector?
It's a race to adoption. So if you think about in the private sector in this space, there's an intermediary. There's a race to profit, but as an intermediary to that profit in the private sector, there's a race to data. There's a race to eyeballs. There's a race to having the most data from the most eyeballs, right? Just stop there and you have the scenario in the social sector. It's a race to market share. It's a race to having more nonprofits in your data commons, more foundations in your data commons so that you become the de facto data commons.
Interesting. One of the questions I love to ask our guests, because we get some very interesting answers, is what advice would you, or just what message would you send your past self? You were witnessing the emergence of AI in your dad's work, and now you're sitting here today at the forefront of generative AI and putting it into the world of philanthropy. What would you have to say to her?
So it's interesting. My mother is an art teacher and art historian, and my father is a computer scientist. And I sit right between these very polar humans. And what I would say to myself is to stay in the middle ground, because it's not about the tech. It's about the people. It's about change management. It's about creating the conditions for organizations to thrive and to embrace what I think is their natural curiosity and their kind of natural innovative spirit. Our species wouldn't survive if we didn't contain these kernels of values, right? So when I work with organizations around embracing emerging tech like AI, it's actually about building culture. It's actually about building a culture of resiliency and change. And then, yes, a layer in, there's tech fluency and tech strategy and so on and so forth. But at the highest level, it's far more about the people than I thought it would be.
So cool. And is there anything that we haven't covered that you've wanted to discuss with us?
I think that those of us who spent our careers on the tech side of the equation, I'd love to talk. Let's come back and do it again. I'd love to talk about how do we find a way to bridge between the builders of emerging technology and the builders of future society and the people in that society, the people who have families whose children will be the future society, that bridging of fear and apprehension. I'd like to talk about how we do that well, because those of us on the tech side of the equation are in a bubble. And I'm not sure that we have a good read on how the rest of humanity is viewing what we do and what they want of the world in the future.
I mean, we've got a little bit of time if you want to just say, what you've been learning as you've explored that.
That was a question for you.
Oh, it was a question for me. Oh, well, then we would definitely have to make that for, I'm somebody who I'm also kind of at the intersection of creativity and tech. I'm the content marketing head at Writer, so it's all about drawing in stories and really finding the human element of where that tech is making impact. So I think ultimately this is about having conversations with people. It's about breaking out of that bubble and reaching out. And in tech we have feedback loops, right? But I think ultimately having conversations like this, human to human conversations, people from different backgrounds, just finding out where those connections are. And then it is a revelation. You talked about having that new perspective on inclusion based on people's answers to that question. And I think those are the important questions to start asking is tell me about your lived experience and how you interpret the world.
Yes. And what would make your day to day better? Maybe AI is the answer. Maybe it's not for a particular use case, but let's start there.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me, Chantal.
It is a pleasure. Thank you.